So let's talk about what to look for and why in a camera system. Despite the vast number of camera systems out there, there are a core set of features that you will want to look for to make your life a lot easier when you're shooting these style videos. Probably the most important thing that you want to look for in a camera system is manual control over the exposure. Now, this is going to be control over the aperture, control over the exposure time or shutter speed, and control over the sensor gain, sometimes called ISO, or the camera system may use a system that is measured in decibels. Another thing that's very handy to have control over is your frame rate. Often this is called FPS or frames per second. Now, if you're shooting standard normal speed video, you probably want to look for a camera that shoots at 23.976 frames a second. That's kind of the accepted standard frame rate for normal speed video. For this type of corporate and presentation style video, having something that shoots in higher speed is nice, but it's definitely not necessary. What is important is that you will be able to record in the exact right frame rate, because some cameras will say it's 24 frames a second, and that'll mean 23.976 frames a second. And other cameras might say 24 frames a second, and that'll mean 24 frames a second, which is not the same thing. And so you want to make sure that it's going to record in the right frame rate so that you can get the right look to your video. White balance is another thing that is pretty critical to getting a good looking picture on your camera. You'll see white balance control on just about all of the cameras that are made, but you want to make sure that you have manual control over the white balance to make sure that you dial in the color of the light that you're using. Sticking with the picture side of things, manual focus is another feature that I think is really essential. The problem is, if you don't have manual control, what may happen is you'll set up your shot with you standing in front of your camera, and your camera will all of a sudden start autofocusing because it may detect something that it thinks needs to be in focus behind you or in front of you. And that will really jack up your shot. And that's not something that you're going to want to deal with. So manual focus is something where you're going to want to set the focus, you're going to want to get into your position, and everything will be in focus and nice and sharp. Another thing that has to deal with the lens that's really handy to have is optical image stabilization. Now, this will really come in handy if you ever want to take your camera off your tripod and do some B-roll shots handheld, because this will really smooth out your shots tremendously. Now, if your camera is going to live on a tripod its whole life, this is not an essential feature. But if you're looking at two cameras that have about the same picture quality and feature set, one of them has optical image stabilization and the other doesn't, I would always go for the one that has optical image stabilization. Moving over to the audio side of things, you're going to want to look for a camera that has some kind of microphone input. Now, this isn't 100% necessary because you can record audio on a separate recording system, but it is a tremendous amount of hassle compared with recording the audio directly on your camera. Microphone input is very different between consumer cameras and prosumer cameras. On a consumer camera, you're going to most likely get a 3.5 millimeter stereo microphone input. Now, this isn't necessarily bad, but it's certainly not the best available. What you'll find on prosumer cameras and professional cameras is XLR input. Now, this is a much larger, a much more robust input that's balanced, and that input will give you access to all kinds of professional microphones. Now, whether your camera has XLR inputs or a 3.5 millimeter stereo microphone input, you're going to want to have manual control over the microphone input. This is really important because without manual control, your camera's going to do something called auto gain. And basically what that's doing is it's constantly turning up the volume very slowly until it hears a loud sound, and then it almost instantly turns the volume down. So the effect is when you stop talking, the camera's going to turn up the microphone input. And the thing that it's going to turn up is all the background noise. Anything that is making noise when you're not talking. Auto gain control is something that can be tricked with a little bit of DIY hackery or a special device, but it's much better just to turn it off and have manual control over your audio. Now, we've talked about a whole host of different features that you want to look for in a camera system. And you'll find these features on consumer cameras, prosumer cameras, and even professional cameras. So what is the thing that sets these cameras apart? Probably the biggest thing that sets these camera systems apart is access to those controls. On a prosumer camera, there will often be dedicated buttons to control things like the aperture, the exposure time, the image sensitivity, the white balance, the microphone input. There'll be knobs, dials, and buttons for all of these things. On a consumer camera, you will have to delve into menus to get to these controls. Now, depending on your tolerance for that may not be a deal breaker for you, but it's definitely something to consider.
Now, what about DSLRs? DSLRs have been really popular in the last couple of years, ever since the Canon 5D Mark II came out. There's been all this rage about using a large sensor camera and interchangeable lenses and blah, 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 blah. The DSLRs were never intended to shoot video as their primary function. So to get good audio on them, you needed a lot of accessories. You needed an audio recorder or some kind of device to get XLR inputs. You can use professional microphones. And you have to deal with interchangeable lenses, and you have to have a wide variety of lenses to get different focal lengths. And file formats were a little bit of a pain to deal with as well. For a while, a lot of the cameras would only shoot in 12-minute clips, which was problematic for long recording format stuff. For short films and things of that nature, it's pretty rare to have a single take that lasts more than 12 minutes. But in presentation style videos, when you get up there in front of the camera and you start rambling on for hours and hours, 12-minute clip length is kind of a problem. You end up spending a lot more to outfit a DSLR properly than you would if you just bought some kind of integrated camera system with a nice lens that had a really wide range, but also had some decent telephoto with some XLR inputs, with some nice sounding preamps that had recording capabilities that was able to do hours and hours on end continuously and wouldn't overheat. That's another thing with some of the DSLRs, especially Canon. I used my 7D for a long time, and if you shot video continuously, you would keep rifling clips with no break, and it was really, really hot, the camera would overheat and it would become unusable. So I usually recommend for folks just to get an integrated camera system. If you're getting something new and you have a little bit of budget, look for something with XLR inputs, manual audio control, that's important, full manual control over the picture, ISO, shutter speed, aperture, white balance, manual focus, because that's pretty important. But also autofocus is nice to have as well, so don't completely discount that. There's a way to work just about anything. We could even shoot with an iPhone. There's a microphone that we're going to talk about later called the Rode SmartLav, and that plugs right into an iPhone or several other smartphones or even an iPod. Conceivably, you could set up an iPhone, even an old like iPhone 4 or something, one of the first iPhones to shoot HD video, and you could use that as your whole deal. An iPhone has control over the exposure and focus because you can lock it, which is kind of nice, and it has an audio input. Although you don't have full manual control over the audio when you shoot video, it is kind of a system that works, all together. And if it's lit properly, it can look pretty good. Now, would you want to shoot video with a cell phone or an iPhone? I don't think so, because there's a lot of other kind of nonsense that goes along with doing that, but you could, and that's just an example of a camera that you could use. And you could scale that all the way up to spending $6 or $7 grand on a camera system that has all those bells and whistles. But there's a lot of things in between, and there's definitely something out there to fit your budget. Whatever you choose, try and make sure that it has a lot of those manual controls, and it'll make your life a lot easier down the line.